All right, ready to kick it off?
Let's go. Welcome, Amanda, our artist. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to present this watercolor workshop, and thank you for everyone who's joining us live today.
Yes. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be with you. I'm teaching you some fun watercolor techniques today. My name's Amanda Donahue, and I have an art company here in the Portland area called the Scribblist, where I create all kinds of fun painted designs and put them on things like greeting cards and notepads, stickers, all kinds of fun things. So I love creating bright, cheerful art, and I'm excited to share how to do that with all of you today. So this is just a beginner level watercolor, so no prior experience necessary. We are going to learn how to use watercolor tubes. So that's the paint in these little tubes. A lot of times when we've used watercolor in the past, we've probably all seen something like this. This is watercolor pan, so it's dried pigment in these little cake forms. This has obviously been well loved by me. And this is a great option. It's really portable. It's easy to take with you if you want to go paint outside or at a cafe. But I really love the tubes because you learn how to mix your own colors, which just allows you to create a lot more variety in your artwork, and it lasts you a really long time, and the colors are really, really vibrant. So that's my number one reason of why I like to use it is you just get really beautiful, bright colors. So we are going to be using primary colors today. So our primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And they are the colors from which all other colors are created. So we're going to learn how to mix different combinations of these three colors to create all of the other colors of the rainbow, which is really exciting. So there's a lot of different shades of primary colors. You could have a really bright red, something like this. But what we're using today is a color called Permanent Rose. So it has a little bit of a pink color to it. It has a blue undertone. And what you'll see as you get to know different colors is that they either lend themselves to a warm or a cool color. So warm would have things like orange undertones, and cool would have something like a blue undertone. So we're using Permanent Rose as our red today. So you can open up your tube of paint, and you just need a little bit. So just squeeze a little bit onto your palette. For your palette, you just always want to use something that has a white base to it. You don't want to be mixing your colors on like a black plate or something with a colorful pattern, because you're not going to be able to see what colors you're creating. So we're going to do that with all three of our colors. The next one is our yellow. And again, you don't need a ton, so don't squeeze too much out, just a little, maybe like the size of 2 peas. And then we have an ultramarine blue. I already have a little on here left over from a previous project, so I'm just going to add a tiny bit more. And you want to kind of space them out just so you have room to mix your colors in between them on your palette. I'm going to move this over. So I also use a palette like this where I can put in my own colors and still close it up and take it with me somewhere. So you can find these online or at any art supply store. If you get really excited about your watercolors and want to be able to take them with you places, this is a great option for you to still be able to use your tube paints. So the next thing that we need is to get out one piece of watercolor paper. I like to get just big sheets and cut them down into small bits, but whatever came in your kit is perfect for today. And then you're going to need your paintbrush. So we chose a round style paintbrush for today's class. Mine isn't exactly the same as yours, just a different brand, but it works exactly the same way. So a few things to note about your paintbrushes. The round is referring just to the shape of the bristles on the brush. This number here on your paintbrush, mine has a number 8 on it. That is referring to the size of the brush. So the smaller the number, the smaller the brush, the larger the number, the larger the brush. So for comparison, this is a number 1 round brush. So it's really small. And then something like this is a number 20 round brush, and it's really big. So I usually use this kind of medium size round brush for almost all of my projects. It's a great brush that will do so much for you. You don't need to buy tons and tons of brushes. Just one really good one will get you started and get you painting a lot of projects. So the first thing we're going to do is learn how to get the right consistency with our paint and start swatching out some colors here on our paper. So hopefully you have 2 cups of water, but like I said, if you only have 1, that's totally fine. You might just have to swap it out for some clean water at some point. So the first thing we want to do is dip our brush into the water cup, and you really want to swirl it around. And what that's doing, especially if you can kind of touch it to the bottom, that's going to open up all the bristles of your brush so that it can really soak up the water, which is what we want. We want this brush to pick up a lot of water out of this cup. And we're going to take that fully loaded brush full of water, and we're just going to pull out just a little dollop of our red paint and start kind of swirling the water into that paint. And the consistency that we are trying to get here, you don't want this really thick like you would with acrylic or craft paints. You want it to be really fluid. So I like to compare it to like milk. Like if you were to pour some milk out, it's a little bit thicker than just regular water, but it's not so thick that you can see the brush strokes and it's really, you know, you have to really work to smear it around. We want it to be nice and fluid. And so once you feel like you get a good consistency going there, it should be a little bit transparent where you can see through it. We're going to kind of roll our brush in that paint. Again, that separates all the bristles so that you can pick up a lot of pigment into your brush to then transfer it to the paper. Now, the paper we're using is watercolor paper, and it is important that you use watercolor specific paper when you're painting with watercolor paints, because it's a heavier weight paper that's created to absorb all of that extra liquid that we're going to be adding to it. Regular printer paper or drawing paper is going to kind of crinkle up when you add water to it because it's just not designed to withstand all of that extra moisture. So once you have your paint loaded, we're just going to do a little swash here up in the corner. We don't want it very big because we're going to be doing quite a few on here, but we just want to see what the color looks like and the consistency of the paint on the paper. So you can see it kind of, if you hold it in the light, it kind of has a sheen to it. You can see that it's still wet and it's a little bit transparent, really glides on the paper easily. That's what we want. And if it's not perfect this first time, don't worry, we're going to practice it a lot more. And practice is really the key to learning anything new. So if you have a second water cup for your dirty water, go ahead and swirl your paintbrush around in that water. Again, you kind of want to let it touch the bottom of the cup to release all of the extra pigment and paint until you get nice, clean brush. Now I'm going to come back to my clean water. Again, if you only have 1, that's okay. It's fine. Use the cup you have there. It's not that dirty yet, so you'll be able to still get good color. The main reason we're using 2 is we don't want to add other colors to our paint unless we're intending to do that on purpose. So now we're going to take a little bit of the yellow, pull that out to the side, and start working to get that good consistency again. So remember, it's kind of going to be like milk, so thicker than just regular water, but not really thick like acrylic paint or oil paint or any kind of craft paint you've maybe used before. And then once you feel like you have a good consistency there, go ahead and kind of swirl your brush in the paint to load it up with all of the good color. And then come over here and just let it glide. If you put your paintbrush at an angle to the paper, see how my brush is at about 45-degree angle to the paper, and you sweep back and forth, the paint will release from the bristles and you'll get a nice swatch of color. And we're gonna do the same thing with our blue. So go ahead and clean your brush again. And then get some fresh water. Pull a little bit of that blue out to the side. And go ahead and paint a little swatch of that blue. And then you can clean your brush. Okay, so these again, remember, are our primary colors, and I'm just going to label that on here for reference. Feel free to label yours if you want, just to help you remember down the road. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is going to be a little like math equation. It's going to be this color plus this color equals this color. So we're going to start off by making our secondary colors, which I'm going to show you here. This is a color wheel. So these are our primary colors. We've got our red, our yellow, and our blue. And what we're going to be doing is creating secondary colors. So secondary colors are what is created when you combine two primary colors together. So for instance, if we do red plus yellow, we're going to get orange. And we're going to work our way around the color wheel to create our secondary colors. So what we want to do for that is we're actually going to start by just swatching out. So we have a little reference guide here. So we're going to start by just putting a little swatch of red. Clean your brush. This also just gives you some extra practice with getting that right consistency of your paint. And then we're going to do a little swatch of yellow. And then we're going to mix the two to create orange. So when you're ready to do this, what I want you to do is take a little bit of your yellow paint, make a new little puddle of yellow paint. And then we're going to add just a touch of red. So some colors overpower other colors, and your red is always going to be just a little bit stronger than your yellow. So you want to go slowly with how much you add. So just take a little bit of that red and start mixing it into the yellow. And you can see it's already starting to instantly transform into an orange color. Now, what we're looking for is just like a classic orange, like the fruit. So that looks pretty good to me. It looks a little different on the screen, so go with what you see in front of you. Hopefully it looks like the fruit. And then we're going to come over here and do a little swatch of the orange. So what's really nice is when you mix your own colors, you could create, 10 different shades of orange, depending on how much yellow or red you add to the mix. So you can get some really nice variation, and it's just gonna create a little bit more interest in your artwork. So once you've done your orange, go ahead and clean off your brush. We're going to do this again, but this time we are going to create green. So for green, we're going to mix blue and yellow. So just like we did for orange, we're going to start by just doing a little swatch of our blue. And this is also going to be creating a nice reference guide for us just to have on hand in case you forget which colors go together to create the others. And then we're going to do a swatch of yellow. And again, you want this to be able to glide really easily on your paper. You shouldn't have to work at it too hard back and forth. If it's feeling kind of thick and it's not just gliding onto the paper, use more water. If it's really, really light color and you can barely see what color it is, you need to use more paint. Okay, so just like we did with the orange, we're going to start with yellow, and make a little section off to the side because our blue is going to be the more strong color. So we want to add just a little bit of blue to our yellow, and you can see it start to instantly transform. And we are looking for kind of like a grass green. So something really bright, just like a medium green tone. I feel like I put too much blue, so I'm going to go back over here and grab just a little bit more yellow, mix that in there. And again, go with what you see in front of you. If it's not exactly the same color as mine, that's okay. We're just looking for nice medium green, something along what you'd see in a field of grass. So once you have that, go ahead and paint that little swatch on there and clean off your brush. And we're going to do it one more time because there are 3 secondary colors. And the last one is violet. So that's going to be a combination of red and blue. So again, if we're looking at our color wheel, the way that we're knowing which ones to mix together is the 2 colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So we have red and yellow, which we just did to create orange. Then we have yellow and blue, which we just did to create green. And now we're going to mix blue and red to create our violet. So same deal. Let's start off by just making a little swatch of blue and red on our paper. And then these 2 are both a little bit more vibrant, but the blue is still just going to overpower the red a little bit. So like we did with the yellow, we're going to take a little bit of that permanent rose paint out to the side, get it at a good consistency. And then we're going to add just a touch of the blue. And we're looking for, I like to call it like grape candy purple. So I need just a little bit more there of the blue to get to my grape candy purple. And go ahead and paint a swatch of that there. And then you can clean your brush. So you can see why I like to do the 2 water. One is already getting pretty dirty. So this is a good point in the class. If you need to swap out your water at all, feel free to do that while everyone's finishing up their swatches. And if you have any questions at any point, definitely feel free to ask. So these are our secondary colors. So as you can see, from 3 tubes of paint, we've already managed to create 6 different colors. And the possibilities are really endless from there. So these are the 6 that we're going to work with today, but I will show you real quick what some of the other possibilities are. So tertiary colors would be the next thing that you could explore. And that is what is created when you take a secondary color like orange and mix it with more of another primary color. So for instance, if we mix orange and yellow together, we are going to get yellow-orange. So it's kind of something right in between the 2. If we mix orange and red together, then we're going to get orange-red, which again is kind of in between the 2 colors. So you can start to create a lot of different colors in between, which is really nice. The other thing I want to quickly go over is value. So value is how light or dark this is. So the way you achieve that with watercolor is by how much water you add to the paint. So we don't use white in watercolor. The white of your design, if you're wanting to have white in it, would be the white of the paper. So you kind of have to plan things out a little bit before you start painting. But if you want to take your pink and make it a really light pink, you just add more water. So we will experiment with that a little bit. And I also just wanted to show you these two things. First of all, I mentioned at the beginning that you could have different colors of the different shades of the primary colors. So here's an example using a warm red, which is very different than the red we use today, which has a cool tone. So you can see it's also going to create different secondary colors. So that's just a fun thing you can experiment with down the road. And this is just an example, again, to show you all of the different colors that you can mix from just two paints. So this is a red and a yellow tube. And then we created the secondary and the tertiary colors. And then I just added water here to lighten them up. So again, you're getting all of these colors from just these two tubes of paint. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. Okay, so you'll want to go ahead and just set that off to the side somewhere. If you need to reference it to remember which colors to mix together, you can keep it in view. And we're going to move on to learning the different watercolor painting techniques. So there's this handout that came with your kit, and it's going to go over 4 different techniques that we're going to use today. So you'll want to get out another piece of paper. If they're small like this, you can use one. If it's a bigger sheet, just use about half of that paper so that you don't use it all throughout the class. Okay, so the first technique that we're going to learn today is called wet on wet. So I won't read through all of this word for word. It's there for you to refer back in case you aren't remembering what exactly the step-by-step was during the class. It's written out there for you. But this technique is really used for creating a soft blended look. It uses a lot of water. So what happens when you use a lot of water, like we saw, is that the color becomes lighter. So that's something to think about too when you're painting. Just know that it's going to dry lighter than what it starts out as on the paper. So I'm going to demonstrate what this technique is first, and then I will have you do it. The reason I won't have you do it at the same time is that it has to stay wet. So while I'm explaining it, it might dry on your end. So watch first, and then we'll all do it together. So the first thing we want to do is we want to have a nice clean brush. We want to have some nice clean water. And again, we're going to load up that brush with water. So touching the bottom, really swirling it around, getting a lot of water on there. And I'm going to paint just with clear, clean water over my paper. And you don't want like so much water that it's running off the page or creating giant puddles or anything like that. But you do want it wet enough that it's going to stay wet for a minute here while you paint on it. So it should look shiny in the light. It shouldn't be drying instantly. You want it nice and wet. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a light color. So that would be maybe something like the yellow or an orange. But I'm going to choose yellow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top of my paper with my wet yellow paint and just brush back and forth all the way down. It'll start to fade, and that's good. That's what you want. You don't need to reload paint at all. You're just going to let it fade down the page. Now I'm going to quickly go in with a second color. I'm going to use my red. We want it nice and wet and fluid. I'm going to start at the bottom. Do the same thing. I'm going to start sweeping back and forth up the page, but I'm going to stop about halfway. And again, you don't want to work it too much, just a nice sweep back and forth. One time each direction will do. And that's it. We're going to let this dry for a second. And what it's going to do as it dries, it's going to transform. So it's going to start to blend together. So it'll create a nice seamless look here. And it's going to continue to fade. So this is really great if you want to have like a background to your painting, or maybe you want to paint a sky. maybe a nice sunset or some water. And I'll show you an example of one I've painted. And what's nice is that with watercolor, you have to work from light to dark, meaning you have to put your lightest colors on the paper first and your darkest colors on the paper last, because watercolor is a transparent medium. And that means that the darkest is always going to take over. It's always going to be the most visible. So if you want to create an all over color background, this is a great technique because it's going to be light enough for you to go paint over it again. So why don't we do that together? So go ahead and take your paintbrush and some clean water and load it all up with clean water. Here, I will do another one with you. And go ahead and just start painting that water all over your paper. Again, you don't want any huge puddles or anything, but you do want it to stay wet for the whole time that you're going to be adding pigment to it. So nice and wet all over. And then pick out a light color. So you don't want to do like blue, for instance, on the base, but you could do green if you wanted to. So I'll do green this time just to mix it up a little bit. And make sure your paint is nice and wet. And then just start sweeping back and forth, letting it fade as you go down the page until it's almost nothing. And then grab your darker color. So I'm going to use blue and start at the bottom and start sweeping your way back and forth up the page. Don't go all the way to the top, just about halfway will do. And my paper is kind of small, so it's starting to buckle a little, but if this wasn't watercolor paper, it would really struggle to hold all of this water. And we're just going to set these to the side and let them dry because, like I said, they're going to continue to transform. You can already see this first one we started with. It's already starting to diffuse and create this really soft color, which is really pretty. I'll show you an example of one I use. So here's one I painted of Mount Hood, and I used this technique for the sky. So see how it kind of just fades down here. It's a little hard to see on the video, but it turns into a lighter blue as it goes. So that is one great reason to use this if you want to create a background or a sky. Okay, so that is our wet on wet technique. So go ahead and, like I said, we'll just leave that to the side. We'll kind of peek at them every now and then to see how they're transforming. You want to have, if you have a bigger piece of paper, you can go down just to the bottom part of that. If you have a small one, you can pull out another sheet. And this technique that we're going to do next is called wet on dry. So this is a really great technique for layering if you want to create realistic details, shadows, and crisp edges. It's also known as direct painting. And this is probably the most intuitive and popular way to paint because it's kind of like what we were doing with our warm-up exercise here, is it's just applying wet paint to dry paper. So it pretty much stays put wherever you place it, versus when it's on wet, you kind of don't have as much control. It just kind of blends all over the page. So with this is going to be really good for, like I said, layering or creating realistic detail. So I'm going to show you some examples first before we do our exercise here. As a reminder, with watercolor, we're going to have to work from light to dark. So let me show you some examples. I'll show you some realistic ones, and then I'll show you some abstract ones, which are going to be more like what we do in class today. So I really love painting animals. Dogs and cats are some of my favorite things to paint. So these are some doggies I painted recently, and that's using this technique. So for instance, on this dog, I would have started with all of these little lightest colors, this really light tan color, maybe this light gray, and then I'll work my way in layering into dark layers. Now the key here is you have to let each layer fully dry before you add another layer to it, or you're back to this technique where you're putting wet paint on wet paper. So you'll do a layer, let it dry. It's going to look funny. It's not going to look quite like the thing you think it's supposed to look like in the end. But as you add each layer, it's going to become more and more and more realistic. So for instance, on these dogs, they don't really come to life until I get to this darkest layer, which is the last layer you would paint with all of these black details. That's where it really kind of comes to life on the paper. So we've got animals you can do with this. These are some lighthouses I painted. So again, working in layers, you're going to get crisp edges because you're putting it on dry paper. Everything generally kind of stays where you put it on the page. And remembering too, that if we have white elements, that's just the paper. So you're wanting to leave that part without any paint. Now, what we're going to focus on today is doing some fun abstract designs with this technique. So for instance, I love just doing bright colors and different shapes, which is great with this technique because you're going to get these crisp edges like you have here with the triangles, or layering to create like a pattern. So this one, we start with the lightest colors like the orange and the green, and then we end with the darkest ones, which are this layer of blue. Or even here, you can see there's some light background ovals in lighter colors with darker ones layered on top, or fun little rainbow shapes. And the key here is just to let each layer fully dry before you add the next so they don't mix together. So what we're going to do is just use our paintbrush to draw some shapes on here. And I'm going to show you how you can use your paintbrush kind of like a pencil. So again, you're going to want to start with a lighter color. So I'm going to go with, I'm going to go with green here. So with my green, and you can start to mix, different shades of green if you want, whatever is fun for you now that you kind of have the basics under your belt. And I'm going to use, see how my brush has a point to it? I'm going to use that with very little pressure, almost no pressure on the paintbrush, to use it like a pencil to draw shapes. So I'm going to do just this kind of oval shape that I'm using the tip of my paintbrush to create. And then to fill it in, I can angle my brush at like a 45-degree angle and just start sweeping it kind of back and forth to fill it in with color. So you can do that, fill up a little area with some designs. We're going to go back in once this layer is dry and add another layer on top. So just kind of keep that in mind as you are figuring it out, what it is you want to create on here. You can use the tip of that brush to just draw whatever shape you want, and then angle your brush to the side. And what that does is it lets all of the bristles spread out and release that water and the paint onto the page more easily. And I'll just do a third one over here. And once you have your design on the page, I'll give you a couple minutes here to finish it. We're just going to let that dry and we're going to come back to it because we don't want to add anything until it's fully dry. But while you're painting your shapes, I'm going to tell you a couple more things. So if we think about one other thing I wanted to mention color-wise, is there's something called complementary colors. You may have heard of this or seen it before, but it's colors that are opposite from each other on a color wheel. So for instance, that's red and green. which we see a lot around Christmas time. And the reason those colors are so often paired together is complementary colors make each other really pop. They're complementary. You would have orange and blue are complementary colors, and then violet or purple and yellow are complementary colors. Now, why this is important to know is that if you mix two complementary colors together, you're going to create a muddy color. So there'll be some version of brown, which is great if you want to create brown, but not so great if that's not your intention. So if you were to layer yellow and purple here, in the middle here where they overlap, you might end up with a bit of a muddy color. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go throughout, is kind of keeping in mind that red and green, orange and blue, and yellow and purple, if you mix each pairing together, they're going to create a brown. There is one artist in a book I just wanted to show you guys that paints in this technique, and it's truly amazing what they are able to create. So I'm just going to quickly show you an example. His name is Tim Gardner, and this is from the book New Perspectives in Painting Vitamin P. But look at how amazing this is. This is watercolor, and it's just very patiently done, layer by layer. Truly amazing. I highly suggest you Google Tim Gardner watercolor painting if you want to see some really detailed, realistic paintings. Okay, so go ahead and set this piece off to the side. We're going to let it fully dry, and it could take a few minutes for that to happen. And we're going to move on to our third painting technique and come back to that one once it's dry. So you can move down your page or pull out another small sheet if you need it. The next one we're going to do is called dry on dry. So dry on dry is also known as dry brushing, and it creates a really rough textured look. So this is great for things in the natural world. So maybe some grass or some bushy tails on an animal, or whiskers on face, or feathers of a bird. This is going to allow some of the texture of your watercolor paper to come through the paint. And that's because we're not using very much water with this technique. So with this one, like the wet on dry, the paint is going to stay wherever you put it, but you're going to see some of the paper break through. So what we want to do is we want to have a brush that has been wet but isn't full of paint. So remember or water, because remember before we were really loading up the paintbrush with water before picking up paint off of our palette. We don't want to do that this time, but we do want a brush that is still wet to the touch but not dripping with any water. And we want to go over here and pick up some paint. So I'm going to create just a little bit of a darker green so that you can see it on the screen a little better. Mix it up. If my brush feels too wet, I could use my paper towel just to dab it just a touch. And now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to teach you how to make a gestural brush stroke. So what we're going to do with that is, see how my wrist kind of flicks here? That's kind of the motion we're going to be making with our brush on the paper, just kind of a flick. So we're going to come over here, and I'm going to start towards the bottom, and I'm going to flick my way towards the top. And I'm just going to kind of change direction every now and then. And just make quite a few of those marks on the page. And it's a quick motion, just kind of. And what you can see is happening is that some of the white of the paper is showing through. Now, this is cold press watercolor paper, so it has this little bit of toothiness to it. It has this slight texture to the paper. It's not totally smooth. There is smooth watercolor paper, that's called hot press, but most commonly you'll find cold press. And that is gonna allow you to have this texture created. So I'm imagining this is like some grass next to a pond. So what I could do now is go in and add a darker shade of green or brown or whatever color you wanted, just a darker shade here. So I'm adding more blue. And I'm just going to dab off my brush just a touch so it's not too wet. And I'm just going to kind of go back over just some spots and do that flicking motion again. Changing direction every now and then. And you can see you can really start to layer some depth and dimension in there. So you wouldn't necessarily do a full painting using this technique, but it's nice to mix the different techniques together within one painting to create something that has a little bit more depth and interest. For instance, on this one here, I used technique number 1 for the sky, and then technique number 2 to create the details of the mountain, working from light to dark in layers. And then these trees are the very last layer I put on once everything was dry, since they are the darkest. So if you were painting, a pond, you could use technique 1 to create the water, and then this to create some of the grassy texture, and then the second technique to go in and put some little details, maybe a duck sitting on the water. Okay, so that's dry on dry. Now let's go back to our second page. So hopefully by now your number 2 is dry. If it's not, let it dry a little more and just watch the tutorial for a moment, and then you can go back in and create yours. But now we're going to take a darker color of your choosing. I'm just going to use this darker green that I already kind of have mixed up here. And we're going to go in and create some layers. So I want to overlap a little. So remember, I'm using this like a pencil to draw an outline, light pressure, just using the tip of the brush, and then I can angle it, pick up a little more paint there, and fill in my shape. And you can see I'm getting nice crisp edges. Nothing is bleeding together. The shape is staying where I put it. So I could go in if I wanted to and do, some other marks too. Maybe I want to use the tip to draw some lines. And maybe layer another shape over here. And kind of use the tip of my brush just to draw some more shapes. I'm going to mix another green. It's just changing the ratios of your yellow and blue to get different shades of green. And maybe I'll use the tip of my brush just to create some little small dots. This is a really fun technique to use if you just want to play around and create some abstract designs. No rules, just have fun mixing the different shapes and colors. Playing around with your composition. And you can even introduce a third color if you want. Just make sure that you don't put it on the wet areas that you just painted. So I'm going to do another shade of green and do some smaller circles. So you can see the difference now where this is, once a layer is dry, whatever you paint on top of it won't mix with it, and everything's going to stay put where you place it. Okay, once you have your design done, you can go ahead and put that one to the side and grab either another sheet of paper or move down the page of the larger sheet you might be using. And we are going to take a look at our fourth technique for today. And that one is called wet or dry on wet. So dry on wet is one of my favorites. It's a really popular technique right now. And I think the reason it's so popular is it really allows you to kind of have the best of both worlds. It's a little bit of a mix of the first and second techniques. So it doesn't require you to be really, to wait for every layer to dry, but it's not a fully wet technique either. So you'll see this a lot right now on things like watercolor flowers, like loose watercolor flowers. And it's, not overly realistic. It's giving kind of the impression of a flower. It feels kind of fluid still. There's some color mixing happening on the page. So it's a little bit more of a gestural technique. I really love it for things that you want to feel like they are juicy or have some liquid in them, like fruits. So we're going to look at how to do something like this watermelon rind, or here, this watermelon. See how it has like kind of movement in the colors? You've got some bleeding of the colors together. That's where this technique comes into play. We've got some ginger here, some pineapple, some watermelon, a cucumber. This is dry on wet. So I'm going to show you two things with this one. The first is we're going to learn another technique with our brush, which is how to use our brush to create a petal shape. And then we're going to learn how to use this technique by creating a flower. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to show you how to use your brush to make a petal shape, and then we're going to do it together. So I'm going to do it in this dark blue just so it's nice and vibrant on the screen and you can see it really well. Okay, so I'm getting my paint wet like we did with our warm-ups. And again, you can see how the brush has a natural tapered point. So we're going to use that to our advantage and let the brush really do a lot of the work for us. So I'm just going to demonstrate up here in the top, and we're going to leave room to do our exercise. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have the edge of my brush pointing to the edge of the paper. If you're left-handed, that's fine. It can point the other way. And I have my brush at about a 45-degree angle to the paper. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to touch the tip of my brush to the page with very light pressure. And then I'm going to start moving my brush away from there, but I'm also going to apply pressure to the brush at the same time so that the bristles expand. And then I'm going to start to release that pressure back up into a point. And it creates this nice kind of leaf-like or petal shape. Now, if I wanted to have it be wider, like maybe this is a little more thin than I want, I would do the same technique, which is start with light pressure, then apply heavy pressure, drag your brush, and then start to release that pressure back up into a point. And then I'm going to come back and do it again, starting at the same point, but I'm going to drag my brush down a little bit towards my body and then let it go connect back up to that point. So you get a thicker petal shape. So go ahead and try that at the top of your page here. Get your brush nice and wet with your pigment. 45-degree angle facing the edge of your page. Let the tip touch the page and then apply pressure gradually as you start dragging it away from the starting point. Go pretty heavy with that pressure and then release it back up to no pressure to a point. And if you want to try making it thicker, you can go back to where you started, do it again, but sweep down a little bit and then sweep back up so that you can end at a point, at the same point. You could do that, you know, many times if you needed to, if you wanted to make it really large, or you could come over the top and do it too. Okay, so that's how you create a petal shape. So what we're going to do now is we're going to paint just a very simple daisy type flower. Again, we're not looking for something really realistic. We just want it to be kind of like an icon of a flower, something that could be easily identified, but nothing like, you know, that we're going to find in an encyclopedia. So we always want to work light to dark. So you want to pick a lighter color. I'm going to use my red as my lighter color because I'm going to use my purple, my violet as my darker color. So whichever two you want to start with, just keeping in mind about your complementary colors, maybe not mixing those two. So avoid red and green together, yellow and purple together, and blue and orange together. Pick some other kind of combo. And now we want our wet paint still, like we did at the beginning. And what we're going to do is imagine you have a little dot right here in the middle. We are going to create kind of spokes on a wheel. So if I have a spot here in the middle, I'm going to start with my point, apply my pressure away from that dot, and create my first petal. Now I want it to be a little thicker, so I'm just going to thicken mine up. You don't have to if you don't want to. Once you have that first petal on there, while it's still wet, you want to pick up your second color. For me, it's going to be my violet, and I'm actually going to make it a little darker just for contrast. And what I want to do is I'm going to poke it into some of these wet spots. And I don't want to do it all over. I just want to do it in a couple areas. So by poking, I mean just touch the tip of your brush into the paint and see how it's starting to react and spread into that wet area. What it's going to do is a little bit like what happened with our first technique. It's going to continue to kind of diffuse and soften its color in that area. You need your base layer to still be wet. So we're going to work one petal at a time, maybe two if you're really speedy, as we create spokes on a wheel around that imagined dot in the middle. So I've got my petal while it's still wet. I'm going to just in a couple spots, drop in a little bit of that purple color, and it's going to keep transforming as it dries. So again, you can turn your paper if you need to, or you'll just turn your brush as you go around, whatever is easier for you. And you could even vary, like maybe this one's going to be a thin petal, and my next one over here is going to be thicker. And then just a couple spots here and there. Drop that color in. It's almost like a little bit similar to a tie-dye effect. And then again, you can either turn your page or turn your brush. You can make some petals thicker than others if you want. A little variation is nice. And if you have moments where things touch and bleed together, totally fine. That's what we want here. We don't want to be too fussy with it. Don't put your brush and sweep that color back and forth. You just want to drop it in and leave it be. Just let it work its magic. Watercolor is one of those mediums where the more you kind of fuss with it and paint over it again and again, the more likely it is just to kind of muddy together and look overworked. So again, I'm just poking, so just touching the tip of my paintbrush into some of those wet areas with my darker color. To create some variation. Now, if you still have a little opening there in the middle, if you want, you could put in another color. I'll just put a little yellow kind of for the center of my flower. But it's going to continue to transform as it dries, much like our very first exercise did. So this is a fun way, again, just to create something that's a little bit more loose. Doesn't have to be super realistic. For instance, when I did this whole watermelon, this is just a light green circle to start. And then I took a darker green and I just kind of dragged just the tip of my brush down in these lines to create that variation that you find on a watermelon rind. So you can do, you can either dab it or just draw a very light, hardly any pressure line, like we did when we were drawing the shapes for technique number 2. And it'll naturally create this fuzzy edge because it's the 2 wet pigments interacting together. Whereas with the flesh of the watermelon, did a light pink, and then I took a red and poked that color in to get the variation. Okay, so those are the 4 techniques that we're gonna cover today. I'll give everyone a minute just to finish their flower. And then what we're gonna do is do a small painting together using some of the techniques that we learned today. So once you're done, you can put your sheet with the techniques to the side and let your other pieces dry off to the side. And we're going to use one more piece of paper here. So I thought for our final project, since it's summer and hot outside, we could paint some fruit, which is something I'm definitely craving when the temperature gets as hot as it is out there. I hope everyone's staying nice and cool. So for our fruit, we're going to use a couple of the different techniques that we just created. or that we learned. And I'm going to leave it up to you on what exact fruit you want to do, but I'm going to teach you how to create a round shape. So with that in mind, some of the popular ones I've had in classes could be a cherry, apple, peach, anything that kind of has that round shape to it. So I'm going to do peaches. I love peaches. It's my favorite. They're my favorite summer fruit. So what I want to do is I just want to make sure I have some orange. I could even add a little of my permanent rose to my orange mix, just to give it a little bit more pizzazz here. But I think I did a little too much, so I'm going to add a little more yellow back into the mix till I get a nice kind of peachy tone. So pick out which fruit you want to do. You could do peach, you could do an apple, red or green apples. You could do cherries, which would be kind of a nice dark. You'd add a little bit more red to your violet to get that kind of maroon color. And I'm going to start. I'll show you and then you can follow along or paint it whenever you're ready. So remember how before we used the tip of our brush to draw on our page? We're going to do that here again. And instead of a perfect circle though, I'm going to create one that has a little indent at the top where the stem would come out. So it's kind of like a heart, but without the point at the end. If you're doing an apple, maybe your indent at the top isn't quite as pronounced as peach or cherry would be. And you're going to fill that in. And then I'm going to mix a little bit more red into my color here just to get a little bit of a variation, a darker tone. And I'm going to use that technique we just used to poke in some color. I'm going to do some maybe up here around where the stem would go, and maybe down here at the bottom. You could almost think about where a shadow might lay, or just where you want some variation. You could try dragging your brush just a touch. And again, we're not looking for perfect realism. We just want something that could be suggestive of that item. Now I'm going to do another one over here. You can do as many as you want on your page. Oops, I dribbled a little water on my page. Let me fix that. So I'm going to do a second one over here. I'm going to leave room because we're going to draw a stem and some leaves as well. So go ahead and get that lighter one on, and then poke in that darker color wherever you want. Just making sure to leave some of that light color on there. I'm even just going to go ahead and throw one more up here, a smaller one up in the corner. Why not? Now, if you wanted to suggest a little highlight on your peach, maybe where the sunlight is kissing it, you could leave a little sliver of white open when you're filling in the center. Kind of just gives the idea that there's a little sunlight hitting it. Okay, so now that we've got our little grouping of fruit on our page, we'll want to create some stems and leaves. So remember before when we talked about complementary colors, we talked about how if you mix the two together, you're going to create kind of a brown color, right? So that's what we actually want to do this time. So I'm going to take a little bit of this yellow, bring it out to the side. I'm going to add a little bit of purple. And you can see I'm starting to get kind of a brown tone. A little more of the purple. So now we've got this muddy color here, which is great. It's exactly what we want for a stem, but maybe not what you want when you're just trying to have some fun layering together. So just like we did before, we're going to use the tip of our brush to draw with the paint. So I'm going to imagine that my stem starts up here. I'm just going to use the tip of my brush to lightly apply pressure, very little, down to where it meets the fruit. And then I'm going to have it branch off and come connect to this one. And then I'm even going to have it come down to connect here as well. You could make this a little thicker at the top if you wanted to have it be a little sturdier stem up there. So the last bit that we'll do is to add on some green leaves. So if you need to mix more green, go ahead and do that. Whatever shade of green you want. Maybe even a couple could be fun. And we're gonna add in some leaves on the stem using that same technique we used to do the petals. So for instance, I'll add a little one, maybe coming right off the top here. So I'm gonna use the tip, apply pressure, pull, release, and maybe I could even come in with a slightly darker green and poke a little color in there to get that variation. Maybe I'll do a larger leaf on this one, some of that darker green poked in there. And then a little tiny one down here. Sometimes what I like to do as well, if you're wanting to fill out some of the white space, is you could just go in and create leaves of all different sizes. And just fill them in where there's space. You can mix up the size, the overall shape. Maybe draw another little stem. But it's just kind of a fun way to fill in that extra space that you might have on your page. And it just looks like someone zoomed in really close to a nice big tree. You can even use the tip of your brush again, just to draw some little lines. And you've got some fun loose fruit. Now I just really want to eat a peach. So you could see you could easily change the color here just to do your maroon and turn these into cherries, or do a green apple, a red apple, a plum. You could even do a little bunch of grapes. So there's a lot you can do just by learning how to use your brush to kind of draw out a shape, a basic shape, and create variation with technique number 3 or number 4. And then use your brush to create these petal / leaf shapes, which it just naturally lends itself to being a round brush. And that's why I love the round brush. It can really just act and serve you in so many ways. Whereas something like this, which is a flat brush, you're gonna have a harder time making as many varied shapes with something like that. So the round brush is really a great tool to have in your toolbox, and this size will allow you to create large areas of color, but also small details. So it's a really a good place to start. So we just have a little bit of time left together today. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. But in the meantime, I did want to talk to you about just how to clean up your workstation and how to care for your supplies moving forward. So what's great about watercolor, which is different than most other paints, is that you never have to waste any. So once this paint dries on here, you can still reuse it. You don't have to throw it away or start over. And what will happen is it'll dry, it'll become hard, but all you have to do is apply water to reactivate it. So you would just get some water wet on the dry paint and let that water kind of sink into the paint and bring it back to life. And then you can just continue to paint with it. If you wanted to clean off these areas where you've already mixed paint, you can do that as well. You don't have to. If you know you're just always going to mix these different color groupings, totally fine. But if you're a messy painter like me, and sometimes the colors just get a little too muddy, what you can do is let it dry and then run it under the sink. And what that'll do is it'll rinse off all of these thin layers of color, but leave your nice big thick layers that have dried and hardened onto the palette. Or you can take a paper towel, get it wet, and you can just wipe away the areas that you want clean. So maybe it's, you know, just some of the areas that got really dirty, you just can wipe them away, or you can do that to everything. But you don't, you know, sometimes with like craft paint or acrylic paint, once it dries, that's it. There's no, you can't use it anymore. But with this, you can always go back and reactivate it with water and continue to use it. So you can just leave that out to dry as is. For your brush, you do want to clean out your brush from any pigment. You can just, if you do it right away and you're good about it, you can just use water to clean your brush and get all the color out. If you're feeling like your brush is holding on to some pigment, it's feeling a little dirty, you can get soaps to clean it. Like this is available at any art or craft supply store. It's just a little bar of soap that you can use to get ink or paint out of your brush. You would just kind of lather a little bit on there and then rinse it with the brush. The important thing is after you clean your brush, you just kind of want to reshape the bristles back to their original point. And then you want to let them lie flat to dry. So a couple reasons for this. The handles of most paintbrushes are a combination of wood and metal up here. So if you just put it in like a cup or something where it's sticking up like this, all of that water is going to seep down into the handle. It's going to rust the metal part and rot the wood part, which you don't want to have happen. I speak from experience. I used to be really rough on my brushes, and now I've learned if I take good care of them, I don't have to buy them very often. Last you a lifetime. And then once they're fully dry, you can feel free to store them upright in a cup or some other container if you'd like. Just never store them with the bristles down, as that'll damage the bristles and they'll lose their shape and you won't be able to use it for as many techniques anymore. And then otherwise, you can just rinse out your water in the sink. You'll want to start with fresh water every time you sit down to paint. And like I said, ideally 2 cups so that you can have one that can tackle cleaning your brushes and one that stays mostly clean. It's pretty light color, but it will get a little pigment just from dipping the brush back in throughout the class, or throughout your painting session, I should say. But that is it. These little tubes of paint, I know they look small, but they will last you a very long time. As I'm sure you saw in today's class, a little paint goes a long way. I just put like this size amount of each color on here, and I didn't even use it all for all of the techniques that we did today. So these paints will last you a very long time. And the one that you'll probably find that you're going to go through more than the others is the yellow. Just again, it just takes a little bit more of the yellow to mix in versus the red and the blue. If you want to see fun examples of watercolor art out in the world, like I said, I make a lot of fun things and share them online. So feel free to find me at thescribblist.com. And on there, I have some free tutorials as well for watercolor painting. So if you want to continue on and learn how to mix more colors and do different techniques, you can check that out, and they're all free resources for you.